This week we'll be taking a look at Chapter 2, Environmental Systems, which includes matter, energy, and ecosystems. During this chapter, we'll take a look at environmental systems, the fundamentals of matter and chemistry, energy and energy flow, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, ecosystems and their interactions, the fundamentals of landscape ecology. We'll revisit the term ecosystem services from Chapter 1, and we'll look at some various chemical cycles which are called biogeochemical cycles. Our central case study in this chapter involves the vanishing oysters of the Chesapeake Bay. It's an interesting story of how the Chesapeake Bay was once the largest oyster fishery in the world, but unfortunately due to overharvesting, pollution, and habitat destruction over the years, it was ruined. And it's not just the ecosystem that's at stake there, it's also the economy of the people that live there. They say they lost $4 billion from 1980 to 2010. There's strict pollution standards, and oyster restoration efforts have given reason for hope. But there's been some efforts there that have failed, and some then, that's kind of a happy story, that are beginning to succeed in bringing back the populations of oysters that live in the Chesapeake Bay. Understanding the rise and the fall of the oyster industry in the Chesapeake Bay, as with many other human impacts of the environment, involves comprehending the complex interlinked systems that comprise Earth's environment. It's good to think of Earth's environment as a system with things coming in and out of it, and with many interactions happening, such as the exchange of matter and energy and information that occurs on a daily basis. A system receives inputs of the matter and the energy and the information, and processes the inputs, and then also produces outputs, such as different products or releasing energy, such as in the form of heat. To help us understand the Earth and its ecosystems as a system, scientists often divide up the Earth or the environment into some different regions. These include the lithosphere, which is the rock and the sediment, the atmosphere, which is the air surrounding the planet, the hydrosphere, which is all the water on Earth, and the biosphere, which is the area of the planet in which life can occur. Categorizing the systems allows humans to understand Earth's complexity. The systems of the Earth involve feedback loops, much as maybe you remember in past biology or health classes talking about homeostasis and how your body systems work with feedback loops. Earth's ecosystem works much the same way to maintain what's called a homeostasis or a balanced dynamic equilibrium. In a negative feedback loop, a system moving in one direction yields output that acts as an input that moves the system in the other direction or the opposite direction. So the input and the output pretty much neutralize one another's effects, which actually stabilizes the system. For instance, a thermostat stabilizes a room temperature by turning the furnace on when the room gets cold and shutting it off when the room gets hot. This is also very similar to how your body maintains its temperature. If we get too hot, our sweat glands pump out moisture that evaporates to cool us down, or we move into the shade. If we get too cold, we shiver, creating heat, or we move into the sun. In a system stabilized by negative feedback, processes that move in opposing directions at equivalent rates so that their effects balance out are said to be in dynamic equilibrium or homeostasis. Now in a positive feedback, this drives the system further toward an extreme instead of stabilizing it. In positive feedback, increased output leads to increased input, leading to further increased output. Exponential growth in a population is a good example of this. The more individuals there are, the more offspring that they have. And the more offspring they have, well, then the more offspring their offspring have, if you can get my drift there, that it keeps growing uncontrollably and exponentially. Growing cancer cells are another example of positive feedback loops. Here's some diagrams to help show negative feedback and positive feedback. This one shows a negative feedback loop. For example, if we get hot, we sweat, and sweating cools down the body. Most systems in nature involve negative feedback. Also in our body, it involves negative feedback as well. And this allows them to maintain homeostasis. One positive feedback cycle of great concern to environmental scientists today involves the melting of glaciers and sea ice in the Arctic as a result of global warming. Ice and snow, being white, reflect sunlight and keep surfaces cool. But if the climate warms enough to melt the ice and the snow, then darker surfaces of the land and water are exposed, and those surfaces then absorb sunlight and warms the surface, then causing further melting, which in turn exposes more dark surfaces, leading to further warming. And runaway cycles of positive feedback are rare in nature, but they are common in natural systems that have been altered by human impact. One of our questions in our chapter asks us, but isn't positive feedback good and negative feedback bad? The answer to that frequently asked question is actually no. Understanding negative and positive feedback in systems can be difficult because the way they name them actually goes against the way that we use those terms in everyday language, such as when someone gives you positive feedback, it makes you feel good. When they give you negative feedback, it makes you feel bad. But environmental systems and in systems of the body, it's actually just the opposite. Negative feedback are the ones that resist the change in the systems and thereby enhances the stability of the system, typically keeping conditions within ranges that are beneficial to life. Opposingly, positive feedbacks exert destabilizing effects that push conditions to extremes, threatening organisms adapted to the system's normal conditions. Thus, negative feedback environmental systems typically aids living things, whereas positive feedback often harms them. So really, it's just in the naming, not to be confused there. Environmental systems definitely interact. When we think of the Chesapeake Bay with its oyster problem, it's not just a problem of just the Chesapeake Bay. Let's think of it as a system with all the areas around it that feed stuff to the system. The Chesapeake Bay receives agricultural runoff from 6 states that neighbor it. And this contains very high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. It also receives air pollution from 15 states in what's called its airshed. The runoff area is called its watershed. Again, the air and the pollution it receives from the air is called the airshed. Here's some sources of nitrogen and of phosphorus that enter the Chesapeake Bay. Whether it be agriculture, from fertilizer and manure, from industrial wastewater, from urban and suburban fertilizer runoff. Either way, there's just too much nitrogen and phosphorus. Too much nitrogen and phosphorus, which are important nutrients for life, lead to the process called eutrophication. This is the process of nutrient over-enrichment. and blooms of algae and increased production of organic matter and subsequent ecosystem degradation. For example, this is almost like a positive feedback loop here in itself, this eutrophication. Nitrogen and phosphorus enter the Chesapeake Bay from the watershed. It causes the phytoplankton to grow. Phytoplankton are microscopic algae and bacteria. So they grow kind of out of control because there's so many nutrients available for them. Then they die and they sink to the bottom. Then that causes an overproduction of bacteria who like to feed on these dead phytoplankton, and the actual feeding and the decay of these phytoplankton by the bacteria causes the oxygen to be depleted in the water because decay uses up oxygen. Well, when there's not enough oxygen, fish and other aquatic organisms will either flee the area or they'll suffocate and die. Here's a chart to help us visualize that. When there is a lack of oxygen, this is called hypoxia. There's that word right here in the chart. This water is said to be hypoxic. Now sometimes it's just this area here, and then that can be called kind of a dead zone. Whereas the water above it, where this decay is not happening, there is actually oxygen up there, and because more runoff from fresh water is coming in, there will be more oxygen at the upper levels. Here's a chart showing global hypoxic dead zones. Nutrient pollution from farms, cities, and industries has led to more than 400 hypoxic or oxygen-depleted dead zones. As we can see, the Chesapeake Bay is not the only water body suffering from eutrophication. Nutrient pollution has led to more than 400 documented hypoxic dead zones, including one that actually forms nearby us at the mouth of the Mississippi River each year. The increase in the number of dead zones, there were actually 162 documented in the 1980s and only 49 in the 1960s, reflects how human activities are changing the chemistry of waters around the world. Let's now take a look at chemistry and its applications in environmental science. Understanding matter, chemistry, and energy will actually help us understand our environments as systems. Matter is all of the material or the stuff in the universe that has mass and occupies space. It's said there's 3 states of matter, which can be solid, liquid, or gas. Solids are those items whose particles are very closely compacted. Liquid, the particles are a little further apart so they can slip past one another. And gases, the particles are spread, not very dense at all. They're very spread out. Therefore, they are a gas. But all of them have mass and they occupy space, or they have volume. Therefore, they are called matter. Chemistry is the study of the types of matter and their interactions. It's crucial for understanding how, for example, chemicals affect the health and the wildlife and people, how pollutants cause acid precipitation, synthetic chemicals thin our ozone layer, and how gases contribute to global climate change, among just the few reasons why we want to understand chemistry when we study science and the environment. Matter can be transferred from one type of substance into other types, but it can't be destroyed or created. This is called the law of conservation of matter. And it's something that happens all the time in nature, as matter is transformed from one thing to the next. Such as, say, atom of carbon is at one time in a molecule of sugar, such as glucose, and then at another time is in a molecule of carbon dioxide. Because the amount of matter stays constant, it's recycled in nutrient cycles and in ecosystems. And we can't simply just wish away pollution or waste. We're stuck with it. It's matter. It's here. Kind of the basics of chemistry are atoms and elements. They're the building blocks. An element is a chemical substance with a given set of properties. If you remember studying the periodic table in chemistry, the periodic table contains the elements that we know of on Earth. Scientists agree usually that there's about 92 naturally occurring elements, and we've even been able to create elements in the lab, though some of them don't exist very long. So we say there's about 20 artificially created elements. Some examples are nitrogen and phosphorus, oxygen, carbon, and sulfur. Nutrients are elements that organisms need in large amounts, like carbon, nitrogen, and calcium. An atom is the smallest component of an element that would still have the properties of that element. In an atom's center, there's a nucleus, which actually includes protons, which are positively charged particles, and neutrons that are neutral. Surrounding the nucleus are electrons, which are negatively charged particles that are in motion around the nucleus in what are called energy levels. The atomic number, also used to number elements on the periodic table, is actually the number of protons. The mass number is actually the protons plus the neutrons, sometimes also called the atomic mass. Electrons really don't weigh a lot compared to protons and neutrons, so often they're left out of the mass number, and when we're looking for how much an atom weighs mass-wise, usually we look at just the protons and the neutrons, which are again the particles in the nucleus. They're really what contributes to the mass of an atom. Here's some ring diagrams of some atoms. This one here is carbon that I'm showing you. Carbon's nucleus here has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and in the energy levels on the outside are its 6 electrons. When an atom has the same number of protons as it does electrons, it's said to be chemically neutral, such as having 6 protons and 6 electrons like carbon does here. Notice I said chemically neutral, not necessarily stable, but chemically neutral. And here's nitrogen, a popular one that we've already talked about. That's an important nutrient for all life, but in excess amounts can contribute to eutrophication, just as phosphorus here also can. Nitrogen is number 7 on the periodic table, therefore its atomic number is 7. It has 7 protons, 7 neutrons in the nucleus, and 7 electrons. Phosphorus is number 15 on the periodic table. Therefore, it has 15 protons. When it's neutral, it has 15 electrons as well. And also, with the protons in the nucleus, there's 15 neutrons. So 15 protons, 15 neutrons, and 15 electrons. Keep in mind, there's not always the same amount of protons as there are neutrons, as we'll see in a bit. Such as in isotopes. Isotopes are atoms that have differing numbers of neutrons. When you think about it, what really defines what an atom is its protons. But neutrons can vary. If an atom has more neutrons, it's actually going to weigh a little bit more than those of its kind that don't have as many neutrons. These are said to be isotopes. For instance, isotope of carbon. Carbon normally contains a mass number of 12, so therefore we call it carbon 12. But when it has more than its usual number of neutrons, it can be called carbon 13 when it has an extra neutron, or when it has 2 extra neutrons, it actually then is called carbon 14. Those are all isotopes. Here they show us hydrogen in its different isotopes. Normally, hydrogen doesn't have any, but when it does have an extra neutron, it weighs a little bit more than normal. Ions are atoms that gain or lose electrons. They're electrically charged. And this happens all the time in chemistry. I've gone back to the previous slide here that shows the pictures of the ring diagrams of our atoms carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And taking a look at carbon, in its last energy level, it has 4 electrons. This is not a full energy level. This energy level could actually hold 8. But we're at 4. So what carbon often does is bond with other atoms and share electrons in this last energy level. We'll learn later about these types of bonds, which are called covalent bonds. But the sharing of electrons out here, using some terms here, of course atoms don't feel, but to help us understand it better, I'm going to say that by bonding with other atoms, it satisfies the need for that atom to have its last energy level full. Although elements can't be broken down by chemical reactions, some isotopes are radioactive and decay, changing their chemical identity as they shed subatomic particles and emit high energy radiation. Radioisotopes decay into lighter and lighter radioisotopes until they become stable isotopes, which are isotopes that are not radioactive. Each radioisotope decays at a rate determined by that isotope's half-life, which is the amount of time it takes for 1/2 the atoms in a given sample to give off radiation and decay. Different radioisotopes have very different half-lives, ranging from fractions of a second to billions of years. The radioisotope uranium-235 is our society's source of energy for commercial nuclear power. It decays into a series of daughter isotopes, eventually forming lead-207, and has a half-life of about 700 million years. These radioisotopes sometimes are useful in determining how long ago something died or how old a rock bed is. Atoms bond to form molecules and compounds. A molecule is a combination of 2 or more atoms, such as sometimes we say O2, 2 atoms of oxygen bonded together. A compound, though, is a molecule, but it's composed of atoms of 2 or more different elements, such as H2O, or water. It has the atom oxygen bonded to 2 hydrogens. Therefore, it's not only a molecule, it's also a compound because it has 2 different atoms in it. Using H2O and O2 and CO2 are using the chemical formulas of those molecules or those compounds. The chemical formula indicates the type and the number of atoms in a molecule or a compound. For instance, with oxygen here, we put its symbol O and then a 2 behind the O to show that there's 2 atoms of oxygen in O2. In carbon dioxide, we use C for carbon, its symbol, and again oxygen for its symbol, an O, and then put a 2 behind the O because there's two atoms of oxygen and carbon dioxide. If there's only one atom of an element, we just leave that out, and it's understood that there's one carbon to two oxygens in carbon dioxide. As I said before, remember that atoms, though they might be neutral, are not necessarily stable. What they're looking for, again, if you remember, is that they want their last energy level full. Now, if they only have a first energy level, it only takes 2 electrons to fill that level. But in larger atoms that have more than just the first energy level, such as in the second energy level, they want that one full, and that one can hold 8. And 8 seems to kind of be a magic number for even some of the other energy levels that can hold more than 8 electrons. But sometimes just having 8 out there stabilizes that atom. Atoms that are not stable, that are looking to form bonds because their last energy levels are not full of electrons, will often form two different kinds of bonds. One of those is called ionic bonds. Sodium chloride or table salt is a good example of an ionic bond. In an ionic bond, there's different charges that hold these atoms together. Sodium has 1 electron in its last outer level. So it's easy for sodium to kind of give up that last electron to an atom, say like chlorine, who might be nearby, who has 7 in its last level, which is only 1 away from having 8 out there. So by gaining sodium's 1 extra electron, chlorine now kind of seems happy because it's got 8 in its outer energy level, and sodium, because it gave up the extra electron in its last level, can now have a new last level, and the one that it has is its second level, which has 8. So both of these atoms are now happy. However, when you give up negative charges or you receive negative charges, it actually causes you yourself to be charged. So because the chlorine gained an electron, it's negative. The sodium gave up an electron, it's positive. Because there's opposite charges with sodium and chloride, opposites attract. So the sodium and the chlorine atoms will sit next to one another, forming what's called an ionic bond. Many salts are formed this way. In a covalent bond, instead of giving up or taking electrons, they actually share. Hence the prefix co means to share. And valent means the outer level of electrons. So as I showed you earlier, carbon generally will share with other atoms in 4 spots. Because carbon has 4 electrons already in its last outer level, it's looking to make 4 bonds out there, or to have 4 more electrons. In our example here in the notes, they use hydrogen gas, or H2, as an example of a covalent bond. Elements, molecules, and compounds can also come together in solutions without chemically bonding. Again, chemically bonding is when electrons are shared or stolen or given away, which then creates that attraction of the atoms to each other. But in solutions, there's actually no chemically bonding or chemical bonding happening. Air in our atmosphere is a solution formed from items like nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane, and even ozone. Human blood, ocean water, plant sap, and metal alloys such as brass are also solutions. In any aqueous solution, that's one that contains water, a small number of water molecules split apart, each forming a hydrogen ion, an H+, and a hydroxide ion, an OH negative. The product of hydrogen and hydroxide ion concentrations is always 10 to the negative 14th. Therefore, as one increases, the other decreases. Pure water should contain equal numbers of those ions, each at a concentration of 10 to the negative 7. So we would say that pure water is neutral right here in the middle. The chart we're looking at here is known as the pH scale. It quantifies the acidity or the basicity of solutions. Another word for basicity is also alkalinity. An alkaline substance is also known as a basic substance. Items that are acidic have more hydrogen ions in them, and those are the numbers lower than 7. In increasing acidity, they include normal rainwater, acidic rain, lemon juice, stomach acid, and car battery acid. Items that have more hydrogens floating around that are not tied up in water or water molecules can be dangerous, as we know. When hydrogen ions are floating around and not tied up in water, they can go off and bond with other molecules, and this is not good. And the same thing with bases. Bases are higher than the number 7. In increasing alkalinity, they include seawater, soft soap, ammonia, and sodium hydroxide. These have more hydroxide or OH negative ions, and just like hydrogen ions, they can be dangerous as well. When they're floating around by themselves and they're not tied up in water molecules or other molecules, they can go off and bond with other things that they shouldn't be bonding with. Most biological solutions have a pH between 6 and 8. And substances that are strongly acidic, like battery acid, or basic, like sodium hydroxide, are harmful to living things. The acidification of soils and water from acid rain and acidic mine drainage are examples of how pH changes caused by human activities can affect ecosystems. One thing I'll also remember is that for each level change of pH, it's a 10 times greater amount of hydrogen ions that are present. So for instance, going from a 6 to a 5, a pH of 5 has 10 times more hydrogen ions than 6. Going from a 6 to a 4, that's 100 times more hydrogen ions. Going from 6 to 3, that's 1,000 times more hydrogen ions, and so on and so forth. Our next topic in the book talks about matter that's composed of organic and inorganic compounds. First, we'll look at the types of compounds that are found in living things. Living things depend on what are called organic compounds. Organic compounds are carbon atoms that are bonded together. And these can include other elements like nitrogen and oxygen, sulfur and phosphorus, and often do. Carbon can be linked in elaborate chains, rings, and other structures. Inorganic compounds lack the carbon-to-carbon bond. They can be substances like just plain old water, or H2O. With hydrocarbons, these are organic compounds that contain only carbon and hydrogen that are made, could be simple as methane here, which is CH4, ethane, which has 2 carbons in a chain, or it can be very long chains of carbons and hydrogens. Fossil fuels consist of hydrocarbons. Things like crude oil contain hundreds of types of hydrocarbons. These are from living organisms that died long, long ago and were subjected to the pressures of the earth to turn them into the crude oil that we use today. Naphthalene is shown here. You probably have smelled naphthalene before. It's also known as mothballs. But it is made out of carbons that form rings and also then have the hydrogen surrounding them. Some compounds form what are called polymers, and these are long chains of repeated organic compounds. Polymers play the key roles for some of the building blocks of our lives. Some things like proteins, which make up so much of our bodies, are made of polymers. The polymers of proteins are called amino acids. Nucleic acids are also polymers. DNA and RNA are nucleic acids. Carbohydrates, sometimes just called carbs, are also polymers made out of repeating units of simpler sugars. Fats, or lipids, are also essential to life and one of our main big molecules of our body, but they are not made out of repeating smaller units, though those are not called polymers. Things like fats, oils, phospholipids, which make up our cell membranes, waxes, and steroids, which form some of our hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, those are lipids. But again, those are not polymers. All of these that we've mentioned here, proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and lipids, though, all do form what are called macromolecules, which are the large-sized molecules that are essential to life. So, starting with proteins, those are long chains of amino acids and comprise most of an organism's matter. They produce tissues, provide structural support, store energy, and transport materials within our body. Even some of our hormones are made out of proteins. Some are components of the immune system as well, like antibodies. They can also serve as enzymes, like the enzyme pepsin that's in your stomach to help you digest proteins. Enzymes are molecules that catalyze or promote or help along chemical reactions and make them happen faster and more efficiently than if the enzyme hadn't been there. Animals use proteins to generate skin, hair, muscles, and tendons. So many parts of our body. In fact, DNA codes for the making of proteins. Cells use information from DNA to string together the polymers of proteins or amino acids to make the proteins that make you. That's how important proteins are to life. That DNA actually codes for them. Nucleic acids, speaking of DNA, are also polymers. They're long chains of nucleotides. A nucleotide contains a sugar. If it's DNA, the sugar is called deoxyribose, linked to a phosphate group and a nitrogen base. You may remember the words adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine from maybe a past biology class. Those are the 4 different nitrogen bases that are in DNA. RNA, or ribonucleic acid, is also a nucleic acid and therefore a polymer. DNA, though, is double-stranded, and RNA is only single-stranded. Genes are regions of DNA that code for proteins and perform certain functions. Carbs, or carbohydrates, are another macromolecule and also a polymer. Its repeating unit are simple sugars that are bonded together. Glucose, a very important simple sugar, fuels cells and helps us build complex carbohydrates like cellulose. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of plants, and also chitin, which forms the shells and exoskeletons of insects and crustaceans. Cellulose is one of the most abundant carbohydrates on Earth. Glucose also helps us form starch and glycogen. Plants use starch as their way to store sugar, and animals use glycogen, but basically what they really are just strings of glucose. The bonding's a little bit different in each one, but again, they're basically just strings of glucose that repeat again and again and again because they're polymers. The process of digestion helps to break those polymers up. So when you eat starches such as in potatoes, you actually break that starch down in the process of digestion into its components of glucose, and then you use that glucose to fuel cell respiration and chemical reactions in your body. Lipids, those are items that do not dissolve in water. They include fats and oils. Those items have a lot of energy stored in them that we can use. It also include waxes, which are more of a structural item, and steroids. And for us, steroids would be example like cholesterol and progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen, which are some of our hormones. Organisms use cells to compartmentalize macromolecules. Cells are our most basic unit of organismal organization. They're the simplest component to all living things and can vary so much in their size, shape, structure, and function, such as a more of a round or square skin cell versus a very long and pointy nerve cell or an oblong muscle cell. They're classified according to their structure. Eukaryotes, a type of cell that's included in plants, animals, fungi, and protists, contain a membrane-enclosed nucleus, or at least one nucleus. Some cells have more than one, and other membrane-enclosed organelles or cell parts that do specific things. Prokaryotes, those are another type of cell, including bacteria and another primitive bacteria called archaea, do not contain a nucleus and often lack other membrane-enclosed organelles. Energy. It's an intangible phenomenon, meaning you can't really hold on to it, and sometimes you can't even see it. An intangible phenomenon that can change the position, physical composition, temperature of matter. It's involved in biological, chemical, and physical processes. Sometimes energy is called the ability to do work, and as we've learned before, it can be transferred from one form to the next. Potential energy, a type of energy, is energy of position. Kinetic energy, another type of energy, is energy of motion. Chemical energy is basically the potential energy held in the bonds between atoms, and we can store up chemical energy by the foods that we eat. Changing potential into kinetic energy can happen because energy can change forms. This releases energy and produces motion, action, and heat. So an example of potential energy might be a rock that's sitting on a hill. It's got a lot of stored energy in it. It can change to kinetic energy if it were to roll down the hill and then change into energy of motion. Potential energy stored in our food becomes kinetic energy when we exercise and release carbon dioxide, water, and heat as byproducts. Although energy can change from one form to another, it can't be created or destroyed. But just as matter is conserved, the total energy in the universe remains constant and thus is said to be conserved. Scientists have dubbed this principle the first law of thermodynamics. For example, the potential energy of the water behind a dam will equal the kinetic energy of its eventual movement downstream. Likewise, we obtain energy from the foods that we eat and then expend it in exercise and apply it toward maintaining our body or store it in fat. We don't somehow create additional energy or end up with less energy than the food gives us. Any particular system in nature can temporarily increase or decrease in energy, but the total amount in the universe always remains constant. The second law of thermodynamics states that the nature of energy will change from a more ordered state to a less ordered state if no force counteracts the tendency. That is, systems tend to move toward increasing disorder or what we call entropy. For instance, a log of firewood, a highly organized and structurally complex product of many years of tree growth, transforms in a campfire to carbon, ash, smoke, and gases like carbon dioxide and water vapor, as well as the light and the heat of the flame. With the help of oxygen, the complex biological polymers making up that wood are converted into a disorganized assortment of rudimentary molecules and of heat and light and energy. When energy transforms from that more ordered to less ordered state, it cannot accomplish tasks as efficiently. For example, the energy available in ash, a less ordered state of wood, is far lower than the available energy in a log of firewood, which is the more ordered state of the wood. Living organisms are able to resist entropy, though, through regular inputs of energy from food sources and photosynthesis. But once death occurs and those energy inputs cease, an organism undergoes decomposition and loses its highly organized structure. Our ultimate source of energy on Earth is sunlight. It powers most living systems. The sun releases radiation from the electromagnetic spectrum. We have a chart here, and only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum can actually be seen by humans. And that's right here. That's called visible light. There's some organisms, such as bees, who can see up here into the ultraviolet spectrum, and even some that see a little bit lower into the infrared spectrum. But what this chart shows us is that there's so much more energy or radiation coming off of the sun than what we could even imagine. We sort this out by wavelength. So we say in the visible light, these are the wavelengths that we can actually see or that the cells of our eyes can detect. The red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, what we call the rainbow. That's what we see. But then there's the longer wavelengths here, like infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. And some of these we can take advantage of, like the radio waves and the microwaves. Then we have the shorter wavelengths up here, the X-rays, ultraviolet. The gamma rays are the shortest and the most highest energy of all of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, speaking of the ultimate source of energy of sunlight, luckily on Earth, we have organisms who can capture that energy through photosynthesis. They have the ability to produce their own food. They're called autotrophs or producers. Those are organisms like those in the plant kingdom, and then algae, which are a type of protist, and then a type of bacteria called cyanobacteria, who get their name from their kind of blue-green color. Sometimes they're nicknamed blue-green algae, but they are bacteria. Photosynthesis is the process of turning the sun's light energy into high-quality chemical energy, or making sugar. Sunlight converts carbon dioxide and water into sugar, moving to lower entropy. Photosynthesis produces food. It occurs in what's called chloroplasts. Those are plant structures in the cell that contain the green pigment chlorophyll, which is really good at absorbing sunlight. It's a pigment or a protein that the plant makes in order to do that. There's two stages of photosynthesis. One is called the light reactions, and the other is called the Kelvin cycle, or sometimes also called the dark reactions. In the light reactions, solar energy, or the energy of sunlight, splits water and creates high energy molecules that will then be used to fuel the Kelvin cycle. During the light reactions, water molecules split and react to form hydrogen ions, H+, and molecular oxygen, or O2, thus creating the oxygen that we breathe. The light reactions also produce small, high-energy molecules that, like I said, are used to fuel our next reactions called the dark reactions or the Kelvin cycle. This is where carbon atoms from carbon dioxide, which are what plants take in, are linked together to manufacture sugars. Here we see the photosynthesis chemical reaction. And this is a balanced reaction here. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide react with 6 molecules of water, Add in the sun's energy. Remember, this is taking place in a chloroplast. And this yields sugar or glucose, C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of oxygen. This is kind of what I call the fundamental of life here. Without this reaction happening, life on Earth would not be like it is, or like we know it. So in review, some organisms can do photosynthesis. Again, those were any organism in the plant kingdom, cyanobacteria, and then a few types of protists like algae. They're able to do photosynthesis. But all organisms must do cell respiration. So this occurs in all living things. Organisms use chemical energy created by photosynthesis. So basically, they take the glucose that was made during photosynthesis, and they also breathe in oxygen and do some chemical reactions within the cell part called the mitochondria, where they break the high energy chemical glucose bonds, and they use that energy to make other chemical bonds or to do other tasks in the body. Organisms that can only do cell respiration, that rely on the feeding on other organisms, are called heterotrophs or consumers. Heterotrophs are in the kingdom Animalia, fungi, and bacteria, archaea, and the non-algae protists. The cellular respiration equation or reaction is actually just the opposite of the photosynthesis equation, where we take sugar in the form of glucose, which this, remember, came from photosynthesis, and we breathe in oxygen, which is also a product of photosynthesis. Thank you to all of our autotrophs for that. And then we make the products of carbon dioxide, which you breathe out, and then water, and then energy. They just put energy here, but it's actually an energy molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. It's like our fuel, and ATP, with its chemical bonds, has stored energy that we use to fuel different tasks and processes in our bodies. So, an ecosystem then, all organisms and non-living entities occurring and interacting in a particular area are called ecosystems. So remember, it includes the biotic, the living entities, and the abiotic, the non-living things that interact in an area. Animals, plants, water, soil, nutrients, etc., air, those can all be part of an ecosystem. The Chesapeake Bay area that we started off with the story in the beginning of our chapter is actually an ecosystem called an estuary, an area where fresh water flows into salt water. And with their problems with their oyster populations, we've seen how tightly intertwined the living things are with their physical environment, how much they can be affected by things like pollutions and excess nutrients. So the theme here is that energy flows and matter cycles through ecosystems. And by saying that, we're holding true to our laws of thermodynamics. The sun energy flows in one direction through ecosystems, and energy is processed and transformed into other forms. Matter is recycled within the systems. The outputs, though, include heat, water flow, and waste. Here's another chart to show us that, how producers can capture the energy of the sun and then give energy to the next level of consumers, and then those levels give energy to the next. But energy then is lost as heat. But remember, the same amount of energy remains the same in the universe. Then we have our decomposers who can help us recycle or cycle nutrients. Energy is converted to chemical energy in biomass. This is called primary production. It's the conversion of solar energy to chemical energy in sugars by autotrophs during photosynthesis. It's kind of a measure of how much work our producers are doing. How much are they providing for us in our ecosystem? Gross primary production is the total amount of chemical energy produced by autotrophs. So it's a total amount of photosynthesis that they're doing for us, but measured in biomass. Think of it like money, like a paycheck. Your gross pay is the total amount that you make. But, of course, some taxes have to be taken out of that. So what you take home then is the net primary production, or your net paycheck. So gross primary production in an ecosystem is the total amount of chemical energy made by photosynthesis. But, of course, the plants, kind of like taking out taxes, they take out what they need for their own cell respiration, and then what's left and is available to the rest of the ecosystem is called the net primary production. So it's like your paycheck after taxes. So this is the energy remaining after respiration. So it equals gross primary production minus cellular respiration. And it's used to generate biomass like leaves, stems, and roots that other heterotrophs can feed upon. Think of it like a budget. How efficient is your budget? Not all ecosystems or biomes are as efficient as one another. Tropical rainforests and reefs and algal beds are some of the most efficient ecosystems or biomes on Earth, meaning their autotrophs are doing a lot of photosynthesis to support a lot of biomass and therefore support a lot of heterotrophs. Swamps are also good. Estuaries to savannas, kind of here in the middle, and some of our least productive ecosystems are deserts and tundras. I mean, it's some limiting factors in those areas, like temperature. It's too hot in a desert, or not enough water, or in a tundra, too cold. So those are limiting factors that would prohibit photosynthesis, therefore making those areas less productive. Ecosystems, though, it's hard to define an actual boundary where one ecosystem begins and the other one ends. So often the ecosystems will interact across landscapes or kind of blend into one another or be a transitional zone. Those are called ecotones. A transitional zone between two ecosystems in which elements of each ecosystem mix a bit. So landscape ecology is the study of how landscape structure affects the abundance, distribution, and interactions of organisms. It's kind of like sometimes there's a mix of different ecosystems going on in that landscape because of ecotones. It's useful for studying items like migrating birds, fish, and mammals, and helpful for planning sustainable regional development. Often, geographic information systems like GIS help us to study landscape ecology. For a landscape ecologist, a landscape is made up of patches arrayed spatially in a mosaic. Patches are kind of a mix of ecosystems, communities, or habitats in an area. Landscape ecology is of great interest to conservation biologists. Those are scientists that study the loss, protection, and restoration of biodiversity. Populations of organisms have specific habitat requirements and so occupy suitable patches across the landscape. If habitat patches are highly fragmented and isolated, the populations in those patches may perish. Accordingly, establishing corridors of habitat to link patches is one approach that conservation biologists use to preserve biodiversity. In fact, in our Science Behind the Story article of the Chesapeake Bay, landscape ecology was used to help begin solving that problem. Here's an example of some landscape ecology. Notice there's some different ecosystems or habitats in here, which kind of makes its own little bit of patches in this area that a conservation biologist may have to study, such as the coniferous forest here, and the grassland, and the river, and the freshwater marsh, and the lowland broadleaf forest, not even to mention the ecotones or the boundaries that exist between these different ecosystems. And all of that makes up what's called the landscape. Here's a question to consider. Think about the area where you live and briefly describe the region's ecosystems and how they interact. Does any water pass from one to the other? What are the boundaries like? If one ecosystem were greatly modified, what impacts on nearby systems might result? Models help us understand ecosystems. A model is a simplified representation of a complicated natural process. They help us understand processes and help us make predictions when we're trying to do the process of science. Ecosystem modeling constructs and tests models to explain and predict how ecological systems work. They're grounded in actual data and based on hypotheses. They're extremely useful in large, intricate systems that are hard to isolate and study. For example, in studying the flow of nutrients into the Chesapeake Bay and the oyster responses to changing water conditions, models were used. Ecological modelers observe relationships among variables in nature and then construct models to explain those relationships and make predictions. Ecosystem services sustain our world. Remember that ecosystem services are the services that ecosystems provide to help keep ecosystems healthy and normally functioning. When humans damage ecosystems, then we must devote resources to supply those services ourselves. For example, if we kill off insect predators, farmers then would have to use synthetic pesticides that harm people and wildlife. One of the most important ecosystem services is how nutrients cycle through our environment in intricate ways. Here's a list of some ecosystem services that sustain our world. Regulating oxygen, carbon dioxide, stratospheric ozone, and other atmospheric gases. Cycling carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and other nutrients. Regulating temperature and precipitation. Providing habitat for organisms to breed, feed, rest, migrate, and winter. Storing and regulating freshwater supplies. Protecting against storms, floods, and droughts. Filtering waste and recovering nutrients and controlling pollution. Controlling crop pests with predators and parasites. Producing fish, game, crops, nuts, and fruits that we eat. Supplying lumber, fuel, metals, fodder, and fiber. Providing recreation, such as ecotourism, fishing, hiking, birding, hunting, and kayaking. And providing even just aesthetic, artistic, educational, spiritual, and scientific amenities. All of those are ecosystem services that sustain our world. So, back to the ecosystem service of nutrient cycling. Nutrients move through our environment in complex ways. Remember, matter can't be created or destroyed, just move from one form to the next. And matter is continually circulated in an ecosystem and is one of our important ecosystem services. This cycling of matter or cycling of nutrients are called biogeochemical cycles. It involves two main types of pools, a source and a sink. Nutrients and other materials move from one pool or reservoir to another, remaining in each reservoir for varying amounts of time. That's called the residence time. The dinosaur, the grass, the cow, and your body are all reservoirs for carbon atoms. When a reservoir releases more materials than it accepts, it's called a source. And when a reservoir accepts more materials than it releases, it's called a sink. Here's a chart to help us visualize that. The rate at which materials move between the two reservoirs, the source and the sink, is called a flux, and it can change over time and be impacted upon by humans. The water cycle affects all other cycles. It's essential for biochemical reactions, and it's involved in nearly every environmental system and cycle. Water cycle can also be called the hydrologic cycle. It's the flow of liquid and gaseous and solid water through the environment. More than 97% of our water is in oceans, and less than 1% is readily available in fresh water. Some of it's tied up in glaciers and frozen, but less than 1% is readily available to us as fresh water. The cycle is powered by the movement of water by evaporation, which is when water that's liquid becomes a gas, and transpiration, when liquid water is released into the atmosphere as water vapor by plants, and by precipitation, when water returns to the Earth's surface in the form of precipitation like rain and snow. Water can have areas where it's stored. Infiltration is when it soaks down through rock and soil to recharge aquifers, which are underground reservoirs of sponge-like regions of rock that hold groundwater. The water table is the uppermost level of groundwater held in an aquifer, and these are places that we drill our wells to take advantage of this freshwater source. Some water in aquifers can be very ancient and be held there for thousands of years. Here's a picture to help us see the water cycle. So we can say the abiotic reservoir of water is surface and atmospheric water. It enters the food chain during precipitation and plant uptake. It's recycled by transpiration and returned to the abiotic world by evaporation and runoff. Here's a picture of what transpiration looks like as water moves up the tiny passages within plants. As it reaches the little pores on the leaves, it will be released molecule by molecule in the process called transpiration. Here's another chart to help us see the water cycle. Humans can have an impact on the water cycle, like damming rivers, slowing water movement, and then increasing evaporation. By the removal of vegetation, that increases runoff and erosion, and then that decreases infiltration and transpiration. Overdrawing surface and groundwater for agriculture, industry, and domestic uses lowers water tables. And emitting air pollutants that dissolve in water and changes the nature of precipitation and decreases cleansing or the making of acid rain. Carbon is also cycled in nature. Remember that carbon forms essential biological molecules. Through photosynthesis, producers move carbon from the air and the water to organisms. Then respiration returns carbon back to the air and the water. If you don't remember, make sure you go back to the equations of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Oceans are our second largest reservoir of carbon. Oceans can absorb carbon from the air, land, and from organisms. Decomposition returns carbon to the sediment, and that's our largest reservoir of carbon. Ultimately, though, it can be converted into fossil fuels. Here's a chart to help us understand the carbon cycle. The abiotic reservoir, once again, is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. It enters the food chain by photosynthesis. It's recycled during cell respiration and decomposition, and also returned to the abiotic world by respiration and combustion. Humans, of course, can have an impact on the carbon cycle just like we do on the water cycle. By burning fossil fuels, we put more carbon back into the air from the ground. It's said that since the mid-1700s, people have added over 276 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Cutting forests and burning fields moves carbon from organisms to the air. And today's atmospheric carbon dioxide reservoir is the largest than it's been in the past 800,000 years or so. And the driving force behind anthropogenic global climate change. The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen also cycles. As we learned earlier, nitrogen is an important nutrient that all living organisms need. It's in our proteins, our DNA, our RNA. It's essential for plant growth. All organisms need it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of nitrogen around us, but we just can't get at it in the form that it's in. It's in the form of N2, just N2 molecules. And it takes a lot of energy to break up the nitrogen bond between N2. That's called denitrifying. Lightning can do it in nature, and lightning storms can actually add nitrogen to the environment. And humans have found a synthetic way to do it, to put nitrogen into fertilizer. But we need a little help from our bacteria kingdom in order to do much more in nature. To become biologically available, inert nitrogen gas, or N2, has to be fixed or combined with hydrogen in nature to form ammonia, or NH3, whose water-soluble ions of ammonium, NH4+, can be taken up by plants. Again, nitrogen fixation can be accomplished by the intense energy of lightning strikes or by particular types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria that inhabit the top layer of soil. These bacteria live in a mutualistic relationship with many types of plants, including soybeans and other legumes, providing them nutrients by converting nitrogen to a usable form. Other types of bacteria then perform a process called nitrification, converting ammonium ions first into nitrite ions, NO2, and then into nitrate ions, NO3. Now it's in a form that plants can actually use. Plants can take up the nitrate ions and then make them available to the rest of the ecosystem. Here's a chart to help visualize this. Again, the abiotic reservoir is nitrogen in the atmosphere. It enters the food chain by nitrogen fixation, by soil and aquatic bacteria. It's recycled by decomposing and by nitrifying bacteria, and returns to the abiotic by denitrifying bacteria. Here's a picture of some roots of some legumes where nodules of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria live. Here's another chart to visualize the nitrogen cycle. Historically, nitrogen fixation was a bottleneck, meaning there is a lot available in the atmosphere, but only limited amounts were fixed to be made useful to ecosystems. But with industrial fixation, where humans can fix nitrogen on a massive scale synthetically, we've added so much nitrogen to our ecosystems and have really altered our nitrogen cycle on Earth. This overwhelms nature's denitrification abilities, meaning it's hard for organisms like the bacteria that can put it back to the environment to keep up. Excess nitrogen, then, as we learned at the beginning of the chapter, this great nutrient leads to hypoxia in coastal areas because of eutrophication. Nitrogen-based fertilizers strip the soil of other nutrients, thereby reducing soil fertility. Burning forests and fossil fuels leads to acid precipitation, adds greenhouse gases, and also creates chemical or photochemical smog. The phosphorus cycle, another one of nature's important nutrients. Phosphorus generally is found in rocks. There's really not much in the atmosphere, but weathering or water dissolving phosphorus out of rocks is what makes phosphorus available to the living components of the ecosystem. Once plants take up the phosphorus, then it's available to the rest of the ecosystem. Remember, phosphorus is a key component of cell membranes, RNA, DNA, and other biochemical compounds. So it is one of those important nutrients that all living things need. Here's a chart to visualize our phosphorus cycle. The abiotic reservoir is rocks, minerals, and soil. Enters the food chain by erosion from water and uptake by plants. It's recycled by decomposing bacteria and fungi and returned to the abiotic by loss to ocean sediment. Humans impact the phosphorus cycle much like they impact the nitrogen cycle by adding this stuff to our fertilizers and then fertilizing lawns and farmlands, and then it enters ecosystems by runoff and then again leads to eutrophication. Wastewater containing detergents also releases phosphorus into our waterways. Here's some ways to tackle nutrient enrichment and would require diverse approaches. By reducing fertilizer use on farms and lawns, that would cut down on these nutrients. Changing the time of fertilizer applications to minimize rainy season runoff. By managing manure applications to farmland. By growing vegetation buffers around streams to trap nutrient and sediment runoff. Constructing wetlands to filter stormwater and runoff by restoring wetlands of long waterways, improving sewage treatment technologies, upgrading stormwater systems to capture runoff, and by reducing fossil fuel combustion. All of these can be methods to tackle all these nutrients that are being added to our ecosystems. Here's a cost chart. The cost per pound of reducing nitrogen inputs into the Chesapeake Bay. Looks like doing things like restoring and constructing wetlands and making buffers and tilling our fields differently. Those are some of the things that would cost the least. Oysters, like the ones in the Chesapeake Bay, help to filter out nutrients in water and make the water more healthy. So aquaculturing oysters that are native to their areas and adding them back is another strategy, and is actually one of the strategies that has helped the Chesapeake Bay turn its problems around. Other items like stormwater retrofits and stormwater management are a little more expensive. So, weighing the issues again, something to think about with this nutrient pollution and its financial impacts. Who do you believe should be responsible for addressing these problems? Should environmental policies on this issue be developed and then enforced by state governments, by federal governments, both or neither? So, back to the Chesapeake Bay problem, collaborative efforts of concerned citizens, advocacy organizations, the EPA and state governments has helped. After 25 years of failed pollution control agreements and $6 billion spent on cleanup efforts, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation sued the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, in 2009, stating they really weren't doing their job in enforcing these pollution control agreements. In late 2010, then, they established the pollution budget in these states around the Chesapeake Bay, and reducing nutrient and sediment inputs into the bay and limiting harvests of oysters, crabs, and fish are already yielding some evident improvements to the bay's health. If you read the science behind the story in this chapter, you'll read about David Schulte from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who helped to bring about some of the biggest helps to this problem. They realized that some of the efforts to bring back oysters were not working because the reefs that the oysters grew on were being destroyed. Oysters really rely on connecting themselves to other oysters, which then over time builds up reefs with the dead oysters and the shells and such. So his plan was to pick some areas and then build some reefs and then put in some native oysters and then cut down on the amount of harvesting of the oysters in that area. And the data was pretty remarkable in how fast oysters were able to grow on those human-made reefs. And it's helping the water quality already in these areas, and they're very hopeful that these solutions will really pay off. In conclusion, life interacts with its abiotic environment in ecosystems through which energy flows and materials are recycled. Understanding biogeochemical cycles is crucial to help us understand ecosystems, and humans are changing the ways that those cycles function, sometimes actually a great amount for the worse. Understanding energy flow, and chemistry increases our understanding of organisms and how environmental systems function. And in thinking in terms of systems can help teach us how to avoid disrupting Earth's processes and to mitigate any disruptions we cause. And once again, this last chart to remind us how energy flows through ecosystems, our ultimate source of energy, the sunlight, and how nutrients cycle, keeping true to the laws of thermodynamics there. Matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed.